you. Hello, everybody. I'm Sally, and today I'm going to talk to you about my experience of using the leadership as practice lens in a PhD study of charity leadership. So I'm a third-year PhD student at the OU, and I'm affiliated to the Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership. Just a little overview of what the presentation is going to cover. So the topic of my thesis is leadership practice at small asylum seeker and refugee charities. And the primary research I undertook was a single in-depth case study viewed through a leadership as practice lens. And the overall contribution of this work is to provide a study that extends our understanding of leadership in the voluntary sector and provides a promising new theoretical lens for future research. So it's the second part that I'm really talking about today. I'm not going to talk much about UK voluntary sector studies, which is the other area of literature I contribute to, but I did just want to say it's a field where leadership theory has not been used, well, extensively or hardly at all until very recently. But there have been a couple of papers come out in the last few years through authors at CVSL and PhD studies, which kind of demonstrate the promise of more collective, distributed, shared approaches to leadership for understanding leadership practice as it happens in the sector. So I'm kind of a part of that movement. I don't want to spend too long on leadership theory because I'm sure you all know a lot more than I do, but this is just to kind of explain my journey through it to arriving at the LAP lens, which I've used in my study. So as we know, there are myriad leadership theories. I like the way Collinson divided it into heroic, post-heroic and critical leadership studies. So heroic leadership studies being those based on individuals, people's traits, people's kind of naturally endowed or cultivated character traits that they have for leadership. Post-heroic leadership being the more theories that take account of a wider set of actors, of influence flowing in different directions across a group or an organisation, and then critical approaches to leadership, kind of questioning the power structures that underpin all of that. Leadership as practice, which has very much been championed by Joseph Raylan, was briefly heralded as a new movement in leadership studies. It's possible that's a bit of an overstatement, but I think it is an interesting new approach to understanding leadership. I see it more as an umbrella or a bit of a toolbox which draws together strands from different post-heroic leadership theories that help us understand how leadership is practiced in real world settings, and also is increasingly used as a tool of leadership development. So what I understand leadership as practice to be, or kind of the main features of it as an approach, firstly is that it sees leadership as emergent and as direction setting. So not as practice as it happens, as it can be setting the direction of a day's activities or a team's project or the whole direction of an organisation. But the point about how do we know if a piece of practice is leadership, it's about whether it is setting or adapting a direction. It takes a collective and relational approach to understanding leadership. So it sees leadership as being shared between people, and it's particularly interested in how the relationships between people and that space in between them creates that direction. And it is very focused on aesthetics, and this is perhaps the unique aspect of LAP, that it really does focus on the material environment and material artifacts and how they can be seen to be playing a constitutive role in leadership practice. And finally, its primary focus is on everyday and mundane interactions, so things that wouldn't normally be brought into the frame of leadership. That's what we pay attention to when we're looking through an LAP lens to understand how it's painting that bigger picture of direction setting. So just to explain a bit by what I mean as adopting an LAP lens for a piece of research, and particularly locating this in my PhD study. So for my study, I defined leadership at charities as any interaction that is instrumental in how a charitable mission is established, delivered and altered. I settled on charitable mission as kind of that thing that is emblematic of the direction of the organisation. And at my case study charity, the mission is to improve the welfare of asylum seekers and refugees in Sunderland. So my understanding of leadership practice there is any interaction that affects that direction, that contributes to it or perhaps alters it. I focus very much on interactions between people, place and things. So I tried to take interactions as my unit of analysis as opposed to the individuals who are interacting with each other. And I focused on the micro and the mundane level, by which I just mean everyday activities, things that didn't necessarily present themselves as direction setting or leadership in the first instance. And finally, I tried to stay very alert to the influence of wider context and power dynamics. And we'll come on to look at the context and you'll see why that's particularly relevant to this study. But also it's something that LAP has been critiqued for failing to do, for kind of really focusing on those interesting micro level interactions, but then ignoring the big elephant in the room of gender politics or hierarchical structures or whatever it may be that could still be having a big impact on how leadership is practiced. So as I said, we'll take a brief look at the context of my study. So I said I've been looking at asylum seeker and refugee charities in the UK. So the UK asylum policy environment is particularly relevant. In the UK, as in many European countries, when people come here to seek the status of refugee, they are dispersed on a no-choice basis to live in different parts of the country whilst their application is considered. And that should happen within 6 months, but it often drags on to many years. So you've got people in new places with extreme needs, essentially. And sadly, in my view, a narrative has developed around the idea that asylum seekers are bogus, they are undeserving, they are not the same as refugees, even though, you know, the majority of refugees are initially legally defined as asylum seekers. And at times our government has explicitly created a hostile environment to these people, actually used that terminology. Sunderland, particularly the city where the charity is based, for those that don't know, is a relatively poor, relatively non-diverse city in the northeast of England. And I've described the policy environment to asylum seekers and refugees up there as lackluster. There are about 400 asylum seekers and refugees in Sunderland, so it's not a huge constituency. They can't vote, they can't work, the council doesn't house them. So at best, they're kind of invisible to local policymakers. There are a handful of really dedicated people in the council who are concerned with their welfare, but really there's just not a huge amount of momentum behind any special provision. There are also problems with local hostility. Some issues in Sunderland have been kind of jumped on by the far right in the UK, and so racism is experienced. But on the other side of that, there has been a really strong local voluntary sector response, compassionate local people, and the charity I've studied is very much part of that response. Moving on just briefly to tell you the primary research that was carried out. So it was a single in-depth case study, spent 14 months with the charity, using qualitative methods for data collection, so semi-structured interviews, observations and document reviews, and it was very much an iterative process of fieldwork and of data collection and analysis. And COVID kind of helped me along with that in unforeseen ways, in that it kind of had to be a bit stop-start. And it had to be online and offline, it had to be a mixture of things, but that actually, because I wanted to learn iteratively and inductively, that worked okay. And I took a reflexive approach to thematic analysis of the data to come up with kind of 4 big thematic areas in my findings. But I also just wanted to pull out vignettes as something that I found really, really useful in data analysis and presentation in this study, particularly in trying to first understand myself and then articulate what using the LAP lens means. So I've used vignettes as kind of actual real life episodes of things that I observed that demonstrate elements of leadership practice at the charity. I'll read you an extract from one, so hopefully that will become clear why they've been particularly useful for LAP. But first of all, I just want to briefly tell you kind of the high level themes of my findings. And what I want to point out here is that I found using the LAP lens, you'll see I'll come on to, it was really rich and evocative, and it enabled me to understand how these kind of tiny micro interactions build into the bigger picture of leadership practice. But I wanted to give quite a thorough and holistic sharing of leadership practice at this organisation, and I found that LAP lens didn't give me enough to give kind of those big thematic blocks. So this is where I kind of embraced the idea of LAP as a toolbox, and I drew on other post-heroic leadership theories or elements of post-heroic leadership theories that you could class as being under the LAP umbrella, and I've used them to help inform my big thematic blocks. So just briefly, those are the first one I've called collaboration in leadership practice, and this is looking at how the charity works with people right across the city and the asylum seekers and refugees it serves to weave a safety net so that there is some welfare provision, some fallback for people, for asylum seekers living in the city. And I've drawn on ideas of collaborative advantage and collaborative inertia from collaborative leadership theory in that theme. The second one is client-driven leadership practice, and this is trying to explore and articulate how the charity's direction in the everyday and at kind of the bigger mission level is absolutely driven by what the clients present as needing in that moment. It's very immediate, it's very responsive, partly in response to, partly trying to be a contrast to the Home Office and the reactions they get from kind of state level service providers. And for me, this gave me a real sense that it was kind of mission nudge from underneath, as opposed to mission drift, which is something which is seen as a risk in the UK voluntary sector, and the trustees of the charity see a risk of being led by what funders want. They very much want to be led by what their clients need. And this one I found it hard, so I'd be really fascinated to get people's thoughts on where post-heroic leadership theory can kind of help articulate this. I found the idea of ethics of care is very useful here, but it was difficult to kind of find a perfect fit. The third theme then is collectivity in leadership practice, and here I've drawn quite a lot on text written under kind of the collective leadership theory title, if you like, as opposed to LAP. And this is, so the charity is explicitly collectively structured, and it's explicitly structured to be a partnership between people with experience of the asylum system and longer term local residents. So again, this theme is an exploration of how that actually plays out in everyday leadership practice, and the tensions that come up and the adaptations that have to happen to circumstances. For example, COVID happened, started right in the middle of this. And then the final one is I've called the relational shaping of leadership practice. And this is looking at how, in a very non-hierarchical, very loosely structured organisation, which is very dependent on volunteers and voluntary action, how people come along and find their place, how they interact with the environment and the charity's everyday practice to help set the direction of what's happening, and how, when you build that all together across the large number of people who are involved, that becomes how leadership is practiced at the charity. And next, I want to read you just an extract from a vignette, which is a demonstration of that last theme. And I've pulled this one out because I think it is hopefully a clear example of how the LAP lens has added value to this study, because it uses materiality. So this is an extract from a vignette called The Mug, and I'm just going to read it to you. The Musab's mug is pink. It has a picture of a teddy bear, and it lives on the windowsill. Musab is a volunteer and client who now gives back more than he needs in support. This is demonstrated in practical ways, for example, the doorbell he fixes without being asked. It is also characterised emotionally by the cheeriness and laughter he brings out in the manager, who clearly enjoys his company and feels she can rely on his skill and commitment. So what of the mug? On arrival at the office, Musab's first action is to retrieve his mug from its windowsill and make a cup of coffee. On departure, his last action is to wash it up and return it upstairs to its windowsill. When asked if he doesn't want to leave the mug downstairs in the cleaner kitchen area and have it washed up regularly, he is clear that no, the mug stays where it belongs till he is next to the office. It saves his place and reminds us of the part he plays in the life of the charity. So here I'm trying to show the kind of the informality of the interaction, and the use of props and tools like the mug actually become part and parcel of how the direction for that day's activity is set And in the broader thematic block, I paint the picture of how, you know, it's many different relationships and interactions like that that build up into actually the work of the charity, actually everything that it achieves in the city. So I'm aware that time is going on. So just very briefly, I'll flag a couple of thoughts that have come out of this study and my experience of using the LAP lens, and then take questions. So I found the LAP lens worked really, really well in the context of a small charity, and small charities often tend to be non-hierarchical, they tend to have permeable boundaries, and they tend to have people wearing lots of different hats. So it's really a useful lens because it gives you this kind of eyes wide open. You can look at anything. Anything could potentially be leadership. It's just trying to decide whether it is that big influence, it is setting the direction. It doesn't make you start with a hierarchy or a structure that might not be the most relevant thing to this setting. I think it also, hopefully, as you've seen through the use of vignettes, it enables a really rich and evocative description of leadership practice. The risk being that if you focus on that granular detail, then you miss the bigger picture. And I've tried to address that by kind of giving those bigger thematic blocks and allowing myself to use LAP as a toolbox that can draw on strands from other theory. Again, just to flag a critique of LAP is that the focus on soft power and those micro level interactions can be at the expense of understanding the impact of hard power. But in my experience of a PhD study, which is quite luxurious because you've got a lot of time, that doesn't have to be the case. You know, it's not so much come out in this presentation, but I have been able to see how that context of asylum policy blends right through leadership practice, right down to the micro level, and that kind of external power dynamic is fundamental to how leadership is practiced. So yes, hopefully it's been a really useful lens to help extend our understanding of leadership in a particular setting, but also just to move that LAP discussion forward a little bit to see how we can use it as a lens for future research. So that's all from me. I just work out how to stop. There we go. Stop sharing. Thanks, everyone. You're on mute there, Gary.
Yeah, I just thought we'd play mute bingo. You know, no, sorry about that. Really interesting. Thank you for that. So questions. One from Dermot.
Hi, Sally. Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I had a couple of questions. One little one. Just if you could talk a little bit more, explain the difference between mission nudge and mission drift. In my head, unfortunately, I've got nudge stuck with nudge theory. I don't think that's what you mean. So if you could just explain that a little bit more, that'd be really helpful. And then my second question was kind of something about leadership as emergent direction setting. And I agree with that to an extent, but I also think leadership is about losing direction or finding direction. And I've noticed that you kind of focus on the mission of the group, and I guess there's a danger there that you're kind of falling into a presentism, you know, that this is a thing that's there, whereas the previous talk was kind of about not knowing, you know, and maybe having this kind of doubt, you know, about things. So I wonder if there's kind of there's a dialectic between presencing and unpresencing in leadership, and whether that might be something that might give you a different lens on some of the material that you've got. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Really interesting questions. So yeah, thank you for pointing out the thing about nudge theory. It hadn't occurred to me, and it should have done. Mission drift is a very kind of well rehearsed concept in voluntary sector studies, whereby charities are seen to be led by funder requirements, and they don't necessarily follow their own mission and objectives as much as their primary driver. They end up just trying to focus on adhering to funder requirements. This charity is very aware of that risk and very averse to it. What I've tried to articulate with mission nudge is this idea that they are more kind of nudged from underneath. So they feel slightly out of control. One of the darker sides of leadership practice there is that they're overstretched, they're really struggling because they will not say no. That's their thing. They want to say yes straight away and do something for somebody in the moment that they ask. They want to be very, very responsive, which means they end up doing a lot of casework. They end up doing a lot of things which are not officially part of their remit. And the overall direction of daily activity and building up to the bigger picture of how they ensure asylum seeker welfare, it's driven by that wish to be responsive and the requests for support they get. So I've called that kind of a nudge from underneath, and that's what I mean by it. But that's a very helpful flag that could be associated with nudge theory. So perhaps I need to think of another term. On your second question, that's really given me food for thought. Thank you. I've ended up plumping for mission purely because the challenge with using an LAP lens is trying to frame what actually is leadership, what's inside leadership and what sits outside of leadership. And the clearest defining thing we have is direction setting, and the clearest defining thing that all charities have to have is a mission. That's their stated aim. That's what they need to remember. Funders can't fund them if they're doing work that sits outside of their mission. But you're right, within that there's a scope for a lot of unknowing and changing exactly how that mission gets achieved, and from time to time the mission itself even is formally changed. So that is a different lens and a different way of looking at it, and I will go and pass that lens back over my findings. So thank you for flagging that one.
Thanks, Sally. Magnus?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me now? I have some problems getting online even. So thanks for an interesting presentation. I think it's very interesting and good that you're looking at this from a practice perspective in some sense. I myself also do that kind of interaction-oriented study. I'm interested in, I'm curious about your notion of leadership. So could you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean by leadership? And in particular, how do you identify it in your empirical material? You gave this vignette with a pink mug, right? So where and how do you identify leadership in this? And that's part one, right? Second one, you have this idea about leadership as being about direction setting. Okay, so one way to sort of probe into that would be to ask, who says this is direction setting? Is it your interpretation, or do you have any kind of material, empirical material, that tells you that the members of the organization, the participants in the scene, so to speak, that they experience or understand or, whatever, this as a direction setting? So what is what are your perspective on that? Who says, so to speak, that this is direction setting?
Okay, great questions, thank you. So in terms of my notion of leadership, so my notion of leadership is that leadership practice is anything that sets the direction of the work that you are looking at. Okay, so that could be a project, that could be an organization, that could be a collective social movement. You need to define your terms, and within that, look at the interactions that set the direction or alter the direction for that piece of work or that initiative. And so I guess what I'm saying is leadership practice is specific, it is defined, and it's inextricable from its context. So it needs to be defined in what the most relevant direction setting interactions in the given context that you're studying. In terms of how I identify it, so looking at, as I said, trying to look at the interactions between people, place and thing, as opposed to looking at the individuals acting in a setting. So if we take the mug, I mean, as a random standalone thing, it can seem very unverified and very kind of just my opinion. But I think it's all about the methodology, all about how a setting is studied, that data is triangulated, that you can feel strong enough by the end of the process that this is a fair and true example to present. And so that particular volunteer, you know, I observed him actually over almost 18 months now. I observed his way of working, his way of interacting, the repeated use of this mug of like a symbol of, I'm not here every week anymore, but this is here, this sits here and reminds you of me. I'm sure it was done unconsciously, but to me it kind of really stood out. And his impact on the day and his impact on the way the charity worked was very clear through observations. And not only him as an individual, it was clear to me that that's how the charity worked, that there, you know, I could have given 10, 12, 20 examples of people who had their own way of interacting, that set direction, that kind of defined how things worked, and it was explicitly acknowledged. So this idea that volunteers can come and find their own place, that there's not a particularly a management structure for them, that they're not recruited, was repeatedly voiced as a point of pride in trustee meetings and in AGMs. So for me, that feeling, it was a feeling I got that this particular type of interaction is leadership practice, was verified over kind of a longitudinal piece of research and through multiple sources and multiple examples. And then I did also go back, you know, I think I shared kind of draft findings and examples 3 or 4 times with the trustees of the charity through the course of the fieldwork to kind of test whether they felt right to them, whether they thought they were constitutive of leadership practice and direction setting. So that's why I feel confident in presenting them as that. But it's about the process and it's about the context. It's a particular interpretation of leadership practice, and I argue that I think that's a really useful approach to take, particularly in these types of organisations.
Thanks, Sally. I think we've got time for a quick question from Jenny, who's got her hand up.
Sally, I would declare myself as an LAP scholar, so I've spent 5 or 6 years in this field. I would really encourage you to, so firstly, let me say that the thing that I love about what you've presented is that you're using interaction as your unit of analysis. You are not making one of the common mistakes, which is we talk about leadership as a collective and collaborative practice, and then we go and do things at an individual unit of analysis. So you've exactly, you know, got round the ontology epistemology mix and got it right, in my view. But I slightly disagree with your leadership is defined as direction setting. There is a lot of scholarship in LAP that says leadership is best expressed when there's a change in the trajectory of the direction. And I commend you to this book, which is Joe's book from 2016, and particularly the work of Barbara Simpson and Linda Buchan, who express this very beautifully. So in this book, they talk about a billiard ball. You know, a billiard ball will just travel in that direction until it is pushed to one side or changed. And in another piece, which I think is published in Leadership, they actually talk about leadership can only be expressed as a change. Yeah, so that's just to say interaction as your unit of analysis. Big thumbs up, but consider whether direction setting is the best expression of leadership. And whether it's actually, and I see the pink mug, for example, vignette that you've just given us as an example of a change. You know, you can read that as another way of change. So what would happen if the mug was in a different position, or what would happen if he was in every day, or how would it look? So clearly him not being there every day and the mug going to a particular place, that's indicating some sort of change. What is that change? Hope that's helpful.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm conscious of time. Thanks very much, Sally. A couple of quick comments from me. I very much like Burak Ok's 2017 article on context and the importance of context of leadership, and I think both you and Jenny have pointed at that. There's a great article by Margaret Collinson that talks about, I think it's SME leadership, and she provides a critique of leadership as practice, which I thought you might also find useful. So, yeah, thanks very much.